I used to think war was the opposite of progress, that it was the place where human civilization paused or reversed, where resources were destroyed instead of created, where talent was wasted instead of developed, where the future was delayed while the present burned. That was what I believed for a long time, and it felt logical. It felt moral. It felt like the kind of thing an educated person should believe. Then I started following the money, and what I found was something that genuinely unsettled me, not because it was dark, although some of it is, but because it was so thoroughly woven into the fabric of everyday life that I couldn't look at an ordinary morning without seeing it. The coffee I make, the device I use to make it, the road I drive on, the hospital I pass, the internet I use to research all of it. Almost none of these things exist in their current form without a war behind them. Not as a metaphor, not as a distant influence, as a direct, traceable, documented line from a battlefield decision to the product or system you interact with today. Welcome to K Missoura. This channel exists to show you how money and power actually work. The version that was running long before any of us arrived, shaping the world we inherited without asking. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how war, the most destructive force in human history, became the most prolific engine of industrial creation the world has ever seen, which industries it built, and why the people who profited most were almost never the ones who fought. Let's start with the industry that is keeping you alive right now, as you watch this, without you knowing it. Before the First World War, surgery was a death sentence as often as it was a cure. Infection killed more soldiers than bullets did. Wounds that modern medicine would treat in an afternoon were routinely fatal, not because doctors lacked skill, but because they lacked the tools to stop what happened after they closed the wound. The body's own immune system, overwhelmed and fighting on multiple fronts, simply gave out. And the people dying from this were not just soldiers on the Western Front. They were mothers in childbirth, children with appendicitis, farmers with infected cuts. The scale of death during the First World War created something that peacetime medicine had never generated: urgency with resources. Governments poured money into medical research not out of humanitarian concern, but out of cold military logic. A soldier who recovers fights again, a soldier who dies from infection does not. And that logic, brutal as it was, produced breakthroughs that changed the human lifespan. Blood typing and transfusion techniques were developed and standardized at the front. Triage systems, the practice of categorizing the wounded by severity to allocate limited medical resources, became the foundation of modern emergency medicine. Reconstructive surgery, developed to treat the extraordinary facial injuries of trench warfare, became the origin of plastic surgery as a discipline. But the most consequential medical industry born from war was not born in the First World War. It was born in the Second. Alexander Fleming had discovered penicillin in 1928, but for more than a decade it remained a laboratory curiosity, interesting, promising, and completely impossible to produce in any quantity that mattered. It was the military demand of the Second World War that forced the industrial problem to be solved. The U.S. government funded the development of mass production techniques for penicillin in 1943. With the same urgency, it funded the development of weapons. By 1944, enough penicillin existed to treat every Allied soldier wounded on D-Day. By 1945, the pharmaceutical industry as we know it, the $1.5 trillion global industry built on the mass production of antibiotics and their derivatives, existed in a form that would have been unrecognizable 15 years earlier. The industry was not built because someone saw a business opportunity. It was built because a war created a deadline that peacetime science had spent 15 years missing. The same pattern appears in aviation, but the human story behind it is one that almost nobody tells correctly. The Wright brothers flew in 1903. By 1914, 11 years later, aviation was still essentially a novelty. A few hundred aircraft existed globally. They were fragile, unreliable, dangerous, and had no practical commercial application that anyone had been able to make financially viable. The men who flew them were seen roughly the way we might see base jumpers today: brave, perhaps reckless, and operating at the extreme fringe of what was technically possible. Then the First World War began, and within 4 years, governments had invested the equivalent of billions of modern dollars into aviation. Not because anyone had a vision for commercial air travel, because controlling the sky above a battlefield was a military advantage, and military advantages attract unlimited funding when a nation's survival is at stake. By the end of the war, aircraft were faster, more reliable, more powerful, and better understood than anything that had existed 4 years earlier. The engineers who built warplanes were the engineers who, 2 decades later, built the first commercial airliners. The manufacturing infrastructure built to produce military aircraft in the tens of thousands was the infrastructure that made mass commercial aviation economically possible. But here is the human detail that the economic history usually skips. The pilots who flew commercial routes in the 1920s and 1930s, the men who built the romantic mythology of early aviation, who inspired the first generation of people to believe that flying was something ordinary humans could do, almost all of them were veterans. They had learned to fly in combat. They had survived conditions that would never be asked of a commercial pilot. And they brought with them not just technical skill, but a psychological relationship with altitude and danger that made the impossible seem routine. The commercial aviation industry was not just built with wartime technology. It was staffed, at its origins, by people whose entire conception of what a human being could endure had been formed by war. The industry that generates over $900 billion annually today, that moves 4 billion passengers per year through the sky, was founded by men who learned their trade trying to shoot each other down. The Internet's origin story is better known, but almost universally misunderstood in a way that matters. In 1969, the United States Department of Defense funded a project called ARPANET, a communications network designed to survive a nuclear strike. The logic was straightforward and chilling. If the Soviet Union destroyed a central communications hub, the entire U.S. military command structure could be paralyzed. A decentralized network, where information could route itself around destroyed nodes, would be survivable in a way that traditional centralized communication was not. ARPANET was not a technology project. It was a military resilience project that happened to produce a technology. The technical architecture that makes the internet work, packet switching, distributed networks, the ability of data to find its own path from point A to point B without a central coordinator, was designed specifically to be indestructible under military attack. Every time you stream a video, send a message, or load this page, the underlying mechanism routing your data was engineered to function after a nuclear war. The infrastructure of your daily digital life was designed for a scenario in which most of civilization had already been destroyed. What happened next is where the human story becomes extraordinary. The engineers and academics who were given access to ARPANET in the 1970s and 1980s, who were supposed to be using it for military research coordination, started using it to argue about science fiction, to share jokes, to build early online communities around shared interests. The behavior that eventually became the commercial internet was not planned. It was the spontaneous human response to being given a tool for communication and immediately using it to connect with other humans rather than to optimize military logistics. The $5 trillion global digital economy, every platform, every app, every piece of software that generates revenue today, exists on an infrastructure that was funded by military budgets and designed to survive the end of the world. The industry was not built for commerce. Commerce colonized it afterward, the way plants grow through concrete, finding every crack in something built for an entirely different purpose. There is one more industry that deserves particular attention, not because it is the largest, and not because it is the most surprising, but because it contains perhaps the most honest mirror of what war actually produces in economic terms. The psychological trauma industry, counseling, psychotherapy, post-traumatic stress treatment, mental health services as a recognized medical discipline, did not exist in any meaningful form before the 20th century. Not because trauma didn't exist. It existed in every war in human history. It was called shell shock, or soldier's heart, or simply cowardice, and it was treated with punishment, shame, or abandonment. The men who returned from wars throughout history carrying invisible wounds were not patients. They were failures. The First World War produced trauma at such industrial scale, millions of men experiencing neurological and psychological collapse in the trenches, that the old frameworks of cowardice and weakness simply could not absorb it. There were too many men, from too many backgrounds, with too much documented military courage before their collapse, for the explanation to hold. The war forced medicine to confront what it had been ignoring for centuries, that the mind breaks under sufficient pressure and that this is a medical event, not a moral one. The psychiatrists and psychologists who developed treatment protocols for shell shock in the First World War were the founders of modern trauma therapy. The frameworks they built, exposure therapy, talk therapy, the basic concept that psychological wounds require treatment rather than discipline, became the foundation of the mental health industry that today generates over $500 billion globally. An industry that treats depression, anxiety, addiction, grief, and the ordinary psychological weight of modern life was built, at its origins, to treat men whose minds had been destroyed by industrial warfare. The industry exists because the damage exceeded the capacity of shame to contain it. I want to stay with that thought for a moment, because I think it contains something important about what this video is really about. Every industry we've covered, pharmaceuticals, aviation, the internet, mental health, was not built because human beings decided to make progress. It was built because human beings were placed under conditions of such extreme pressure, such concentrated urgency, such catastrophic need, that solutions which peacetime had failed to find for decades were found in years, sometimes in months. War is not the only way to create that pressure, but it is the most brutal. And the industries it creates carry that brutality in their DNA, in the specific shape of their solutions, in the particular problems they were designed to solve, in the human beings whose suffering made the urgency undeniable. Every antibiotic you have ever taken was made possible by a decision to fund mass production, because soldiers were dying of infected wounds. Every commercial flight you have taken used technology whose development was funded because governments needed to control airspace over battlefields. Every time you use the internet, you are using infrastructure designed for a world in which nuclear war had already happened. None of this makes war good. It makes the economics of war honest in a way that is deeply uncomfortable. The same events that produce the most concentrated human suffering in history also produce, as a byproduct, the industries that alleviate suffering for generations afterward. And the people who build those industries, who take the military technology and the wartime research and turn it into something that improves ordinary life, are almost never the same people who fought. They are the ones who came after, who inherited the infrastructure of catastrophe and asked a different question with it. That question, asked again and again across history, is the real engine behind everything on this list. Not war, not governments, not defense budgets, but the human refusal to let the infrastructure of destruction sit idle when it could be turned towards something else. Subscribe if you haven't yet. It costs nothing, and it's how you make sure these videos keep reaching you. The world makes a lot more sense when you know where to look. Which part of this surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. I'm Kay Mazora. See you in the next one.